You think you know what slavery was? The story of the transatlantic slave trade is horrifying, but it's just a fraction of a much darker, longer, and more hidden chapter of history. For over 1,400 years, a system existed that didn't just exploit people. It deleted entire cultures, languages, and civilizations from the face of the earth. This is the story of the Islamic slave trade, a vast, bureaucratic, and brutally efficient system that spanned continents and centuries, and whose victims have all but vanished from history. Today, we're uncovering this buried past, using primary sources from Ottoman archives, medieval legal codes, and archaeological discoveries. What you're about to hear isn't conjecture. It's documented fact, verified by historians, and yet largely erased from mainstream education. Why? Because the truth is too explosive, too uncomfortable for our sanitized view of history. Part 1, Child Theft as Policy. The Devshirme System. Imagine your worst nightmare as a parent. It's not your child forgetting to call home. It's hearing a knock at the door and watching as government officials demand your 12-year-old son. He isn't going to camp. He isn't coming back. This was the fate of Christian families across the Balkans for over 6 centuries. Every year, in thousands of villages, boys aged 8 to 18 were rounded up by Ottoman officials. It was not random violence, but a calculated, codified system. Soldiers arrived, lined the boys up like livestock, and tested their bodies and minds. Teeth inspected, reflexes checked, questions posed to measure intelligence. The Ottoman Empire kept manuals on how to select the best candidates. Some parents tried everything, falling to their knees, offering gold, livestock, even their own lives. The officials' response? A boy in good health was worth more than an entire village. Resistance was futile. A father who attacked the collectors was beaten unconscious in front of his child. What made this horror truly perverse was its cyclical nature. Some of the stolen boys, decades later, would return not as sons, but as soldiers, tasked with collecting the next generation of children. The psychological trauma was profound. One case, Sakalo Mehmed Pasha, a Serbian Orthodox child taken at 10, rose to become Grand Vizier of the empire. His power allowed him to send armies to raid villages, just like the one he came from. Even acts that seemed like gestures to his homeland, a famous bridge built in his childhood village, were actually tools for further conquest. One village in 1463 lost every boy between 8 and 18 in a single sweep. The community was doomed. Without sons to inherit land, work the fields, or start families, the village was abandoned within a generation. Houses left as if people had just vanished, a civilization erased not by war, but by the systematic theft of children. Part 2. The science of selection and reprogramming. The Devshirme system wasn't just about stealing children. It was about manufacturing loyalty and erasing identity. Once selected, boys were immediately isolated from anyone who spoke their language, then subjected to relentless re-education. They learned Turkish and Islamic law, and were punished for any attachment to their origins. Their old names were erased. In their place, a new identity was built, one that would fight for the empire that stole them. The most successful became the Janissaries, the empire's elite military corps, feared across the world for centuries. Imagine parents today worried about social media influencing their kids. In the Balkans, parents broke their children's bones or mutilated them to make them ineligible for selection. Better a scarred child at home than a perfect one stolen forever. It worked. Between 200,000 and 500,000 children were processed through the system, each one a node in a network of suffering, each one a weapon forged from the raw material of stolen lives. Part 3. Industrialized castration. An economy of human mutilation. If you thought child theft was the worst of it, think again. There was a parallel industry with a 90% mortality rate, one so shocking most historians avoid it. Castration centers in places like Aswan, Egypt, operated with chilling efficiency. Thousands of boys and young men were subjected to crude operations every year, most dying in agony. Business records show the economics. The value of a boy tripled after a successful castration. They even had insurance policies on caravans, with rates varying depending on whether the inventory survived intact. Mass burial sites have been found near these centers, filled with the bones of boys from 7 to 25, most never making it home. Survivor memoirs describe a factory of death. For those who did survive, their reward was a lifetime of dependency. Eunuchs could not form families, posed no dynastic threat, and were often valued as palace servants or harem overseers, prized because their humanity had been literally destroyed. Why endure such a loss? Because the market made it profitable. A slave boy after castration might fetch 3 times the price, even if 9 out of 10 died in the process. Part 4. The Trans-Saharan Nightmare. A slave trade lost to time. The Atlantic slave trade, which brought 12 million Africans across the ocean in 4 centuries, is taught everywhere. But the Islamic slave trade lasted 1,400 years, with up to 17 million Africans enslaved. most never surviving to have descendants. This wasn't just about numbers. Unlike the Americas, where enslaved populations built new communities, here, entire lineages were wiped out. The journey across the Sahara was a death sentence. Of every 1,000 slaves forced to march across the desert, 800 died on the way. Archaeologists have found chains of skeletons still wearing their shackles, mass graves near watering holes, and bodies left in the sand where they fell. Women and children were particularly targeted. Documentation shows 70% of slaves sold in some markets were under 18, and 2 females were traded for every male. Most males were either killed in the castration process or died in military service. Most females were absorbed into harems or domestic servitude, a euphemism that hid systemic sexual exploitation. Some African kingdoms were forced to pay annual tributes of hundreds of slaves for centuries, literally handing over their youth in exchange for survival. The effect? Entire regions depopulated, languages extinguished, cultures wiped out as if they never existed. Part 5. Economic warfare. Taxation as a weapon of genocide, but the system didn't just rely on slavery. Economic destruction was wielded as a weapon. Non-Muslims paid crushing taxes, often 50 to 80% of their harvests, just for the right to exist. If a Christian family's eldest son converted to Islam, their tax burden dropped from 70% to 25%. It was a survival choice that ensured their land would eventually pass out of their hands anyway. Records from Egypt in 950 CE show how the state calculated starvation. 3 children of brothers the farmer died this winter. Expected tax revenue reduced by future projections. The devastation was deliberate. Sometimes villages were taxed at 90%. Resistance was met with executions, confiscations, and the kidnapping of children for the Devshirme. Over generations, this slow genocide destroyed cultures. Property could not be inherited, generational wealth was impossible, and communities were trapped in perpetual poverty. The only way out was conversion, and even then, the price was cultural erasure. Part 6. Erasing civilizations. Cultural and linguistic genocide. The most insidious form of destruction was cultural. Languages that had existed for millennia, like Coptic, the final descendant of ancient Egyptian, were stamped out by making Arabic the only language of power, trade, and administration. Fire temples of Zoroastrianism, once the heart of Persian civilization, were destroyed or converted into mosques, their sacred fires deliberately extinguished. Libraries, like Nalanda in India, which contained millions of books and centuries of knowledge, were burned to the ground. Monks and scholars were killed, sometimes burned alive with their manuscripts. In Afghanistan, the Buddhist civilization vanished completely. Statues and temples destroyed, the population either killed or driven out. Today, few even remember they ever existed. Religions like Zoroastrianism, Buddhism in Central Asia, and Christianity in Egypt and Nubia were deliberately erased. The destruction wasn't random. It was policy, carried out through a combination of violence, economics, and psychological warfare. Part 7. Sexual slavery. Systematic dehumanization of women. If you think this horror was reserved for men and boys, think again. The Ottoman Empire alone trafficked 1.5 million women for sexual slavery. In the slave port of Kaffa, 20,000 women were sold each year, mostly aged 12 to 25, with prices set by age and ethnicity. The demand was so great that families often scarred their own daughters' faces to make them less desirable, a desperate act of love in the face of systematic rape and exploitation. Records from the Topkapi Palace reveal a bureaucracy of sexual slavery, receipts, purchase orders, and inventory lists for women purchased for the Sultan's harem. Inside, suicide and murder were common. Children born to slave mothers were either absorbed as property or killed. There was no future for these women or their offspring. No lineage, no memory, just endless cycles of trauma. Over 14 centuries, at least 10 million women and girls across the Islamic empires were enslaved for sexual purposes. Their stories have been erased so thoroughly, most have no descendants to remember them at all. Part 8. How it was hidden, silence, suppression, and erasure. All of this is documented. Ottoman archives, Islamic legal texts, European diplomatic reports. Yet if you look for academic courses on Islamic slavery, you'll find almost none. By contrast, hundreds of courses and documentaries cover Atlantic slavery. Why? Oil money, political pressure, and fear. Scholars who try to study this face threats, ostracism, even the end of their careers. Middle Eastern states fund university departments and dictate acceptable research topics. UN resolutions, and the media focus almost entirely on the Atlantic slave trade. The result? A 14th century Holocaust erased from memory, with no museums, no public recognition, and no pressure for accountability. Genetic studies show the scars: population gaps, lost languages, erased cultures, and gender imbalances that can only be explained by centuries of population destruction. But to connect those dots to this history is still taboo. Part 9. The numbers. A machine of destruction. This was industrial-scale human destruction, 500,000 children stolen through Devshirme, 5 to 8 million subjected to castration, with only 10% surviving, up to 17 million Africans enslaved, most dying before they could have children, 10 to 15 million women trafficked for sexual slavery, millions more killed in raids, forced conversions, or starved through economic policy. The true death toll, over 100 million lives destroyed across 14 centuries. But the greater crime is erasure, not just of people, but of memory, history, and culture. Part 10. Why this matters. We like to think that history moves toward progress and justice. But this story shows how evil can become routine, systematic, and bureaucratic. The genius of this system was its sustainability. It extracted value from the oppressed just fast enough to avoid killing them all at once. Today, the countries and institutions that benefited from this system sit on human rights councils, their past sanitized. The justifications for atrocity are still taught as classical law. The palaces built from slave labor are now tourist attractions. The victims, meanwhile, left no descendants to demand remembrance. That if you are shocked by this history, that's good. It means you still care. The world you live in, with your flawed freedoms and imperfect justice, is paradise compared to the reality faced by hundreds of millions who lived under these systems. Remember, everything we take for granted, from our languages to our families, exists because we are not living in that era. Closing now. You know what they tried to hide: 14 centuries of slavery, erasure, and genocide, hidden in plain sight. The question is, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you let it fade into silence, or will you help break the perfect crime by sharing what you've learned? The choice is yours, because history only stays hidden if we let it.